Welcome, gentlemen, gentlewomen, and gentle children. Today is Monday. It's also the 408th anniversary of the time Galileo Galilei got banned from the Catholic Church for trying to claim that the Earth orbits the Sun. Now, there are similar statements that might also get you banned from the WoW community. One of which could be, for example, that you actually like Augmentation Evoker. And this is today's point, trying to draw the picture of how did the implementation of this new first time ever support/buff spec in the game. We are at this point by the end of the expansion, even considering the next season is not going to bring any, drastic changes or whatnot. This is what we are left with in terms of the addition of the Evoker as a class, and specifically of Augmentation as a special kind of DPS. Now, obviously, Augmentation, when it was introduced, caused some players to raise their eyebrows because of the way in which it could be abused. The whole idea around buffing players of course trying to tinker and find ways to turn this out of control in multiple different ways thanks to the usage of multiple Augmentation Evoker. You must have seen multiple clips or videos of groups with 5, 10 or even more Augmentation Evokers just killing bosses in 10 seconds with unholy Death Knights pulling 1, 2, 3 million DPS. This was the result of the implementation of this new spec. Then there was also the unique feature of the spec, of course, not actually doing damage themselves. Blizzard deciding not to show the damage done of the evokers in the in-game damage meters, but only detectable through the logs to the third-party softwares or sites that could detect the damage done by that spec, which also ended up being even more problematic because it also suffered from multiple specs having multiple abilities not being recognized by the evoker, not actually attributing the damage to the evoker. So it made it even harder to actually figure out how much damage an evoker was actually doing. But the general consensus, even on release of Aberrus, was that Augmentation was still doing quite well in the raid, and more importantly, was creating something quite problematic in Mythic Plus. That was what was quite visible quite quickly in the meta of the game due to what Augmentation was giving the group. Because one thing is to have good damage, right? However, what happens if you give good damage while also making everyone around you more tanky? Also, what happens if you give primary stat to something like a tank and something like a healer? So now suddenly you don't just do more damage, now you also help the tank stay alive better and also help the healer heal more. This combo proved to be deadly for the meta of Mythic Plus because it meant that basically you could only start going up to certain key levels only if you had an Augmentation Evoker, only if you could give your healer 10, 15% even more healing done, while simultaneously making him more tanky, giving him 10, 15+% more stamina, an absorb shield on demand, versatility buffs, etc, etc. All of this turned Augmentation into an abomination, and over time we have an entire list. We have the entire history of the several rounds of nerfs given to the burst damage of Augmentation with their Breath of Eon's cooldown, the extra damage that they can give the party with things like Fate's Mirror. The nerfs continued, the defensiveness, the tankiness, the utility of Augmentation over time on multiple fronts was being nerfed more and more and more to try to bring it more in line with other specs. However, the problem remained. The problem of Augmentation is that even if you nerf all of these things, they will still be, unique features compared to other specs. For example, being able to buff players with more stamina or more versatility were things that either you're a druid with Mark of the Wild or a priest with Fortitude, or you don't have that feature. And on top of that, the buff given by Augmentation was even higher than those two other classes. So even despite the nerfs, over time it remained a very powerful utility spec which had been used both in Aberrus, but up to that point, Augmentation came out after Aberrus was released. So it's it's harder to gauge how meta could have been the spec in the raid, considering it came out after the release of the tier. However, we did see the release of Amirjasil, the full-fledged release of a raid where augmentation was already available. And at the release of Amirjasil, we did see augmentation being one of the most used, one of the most played specs in Mythic. Even if we go back to Aberrus, even after the weeks we had to wait for augmentation to actually come out, augmentation was still a very played spec in the raid. Obviously, you don't have to be reminded of the nightmares that happened in Mythic Plus. From the moment augmentation was made available in the patch, it dominated the season in its entirety as a choice. And this continued, of course, in the next season. Augmentation continued to be the main primary pick in Mythic Plus. However, I think it's a good time now to start thinking about the picture, how the state of augmentation right now, if it's still as oppressive, annoying, or just not as fun to be around with as a spec in your raids or in your Mythic Plus groups. Because as we went onwards with this season, right, as we kept going up and up week by week, augmentation over time, has not exactly continued to dominate the scene in Mythic Plus. At the moment, it has suffered a drastic loss of players. Now, to this point, about 3 months into the season, augmentation is not even in the top 5 of most played specs in Mythic Plus. So, if we probably ask the question, how do you feel about augmentation? Do you think the implementation of the spec in the game was successful? If we ask you this anywhere around here, possibly even anywhere around here, the answers could have been much more harsh against the spec. But now it doesn't seem like it is nearly as much of a must in most of the groups in Mythic Plus, for example. Obviously, we can still use the asterisk of the top keys, the very, very competitive groups, where we still see augmentation as a very prevalent pick in many groups, but is no longer in all groups, because and again, I'm sorry having to go back to remind everyone of what happened in this season, but if we have to go back to season 2, you will see an Augmentation Evoker in every single one of the groups. If we go back instead now, yes, it's still there, but you start seeing more and more groups already trickling down without an Augmentation Evoker, right? So it's already a significant change at the top level, the toppest level of Mythic Plus. But even if you go down to the more high competitive level, while still not being, super elite, top 0.1% of the players, 27, 28 level keys, augmentation has lost a lot of its presence. And even if we have to go with the comparison between season 2 and season 3, augmentation's popularity has gone down a bit compared to the previous raid tier. Obviously, you could be giving me the very simple answer, duh. Of course it's played less. You just went through, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sets of nerfs over and over and over until they made it weak enough that it wasn't that worth to play. So that's likely the reason why fewer players are playing Augmentation Evoker. However, mine is more of a general question. If the spec is healthy or not. You can have in a season of Mythic Plus or in a season of the raid, you can have a certain spec being super popular or super powerful while being a bit unhealthy, or while being, for example, not even fun to play, not even fun to do the rotation, or to be in certain situations that are not as satisfying to pull off. There have been times, for example, where Destruction was popular, yet the whole state of the spec wasn't very good, or things like Assassination Rogue also having plenty of problems before the rework, even when they were doing well. Shadow Priest is a classic of sometimes doing well, even though being very convoluted, still having plenty of problems in every other one of the reworks that Blizzard puts them through, apparently every season. So that is still a worthwhile question for augmentation. even now that their power level is clearly not nearly as big as a few months ago, both in Mythic Plus but also in the raid. One of the biggest complaints at the time was you can't have a spec do well. You can't have a spec do well while also giving you the stuff augmentation gives you. Players were obviously pointing out that if augmentation is here in terms of damage, while also giving other players stamina, giving them versatility, giving them a defensive shield, having a big cooldown for the raid to do more burst damage, buffing, of course, other players as well, then what possible reason would you have to pick any of the specs below augmentation? Why would you pick marksmanship or elemental or shadow or beast mastery when augmentation is here? Augmentation is already out-damaging them and also buffs a bunch of other players in defensive ways, whether it is stamina or damage reduction or buffing the healing dawn of the healers, for example, or the tankiness of the tanks, which is even more valuable in something like Mythic Plus, more so than the raid. It seems like now, after the 54th set of nerfs given to augmentation, over time, players have gone further and further away from picking augmentation in Mythic Plus. They are not nearly as, they're not nearly as into stacking multiple augmentation evokers in the raid either. Previously there were talks, or you straight up saw yourself even 3 or 4 augmentation evokers in the same raid, even in Mythic. Now it's much more rare. Now you see 1, sometimes 2. That's at the very most. Which is healthy, right? I would say that a reasonably healthy situation to be in when it comes to forming your raid. In Mythic Plus, it does seem like we are in a more average situation compared to the nightmare of Season 2. Nowadays, the presence has gone down by a lot. So the question as we approach Season 4, but eventually also, of course, the War Within expansion, how do we feel about the implementation of this buff bot spec in the game? I would by default start by praising Blizzard for trying something different, right? Trying something new. That's always worthwhile. You can still fail and go back to something else, but at least we try to add something different in the game, shake things up in the meta, for example. So that is a laudable effort from Blizzard. Now, as far as the execution, we have seen it took quite a few months to get most of everything. There are still some problems with the attribution of the damage of augmentation, but after a few months now, a lot of the things have been fixed. Yes, the spec was ungodly overpowered on release. We had to wait for months and series after series of nerfs to make it more in line. We basically had to sacrifice an entire Mythic Plus season for Blizzard to have time to start adjusting the spec, but now it seems like it's more in line with the rest. I feel like the biggest complaint when it comes to Augmentation Evoker is even after you exclude all the overpoweredness, right? If we don't complain about all of the extra stuff we talked about, the extra defensiveness they can give to the group as a DPS spec, which is always going to stay a problem. The other thing is, of course, how simple it is to pilot, how easy it is to execute. There is not a lot of width of skill expression when playing an Augmentation Evoker. You have very few damage buttons. Your prescience is even smart targeting, especially in Mythic Plus. You barely even have to bother or just pay attention to prescience in Mythic Plus. Slightly more now with your tier set having the 3rd prescience out now, but in general it's not a very high maintenance type of buff. Most of your other buffs are passive. They come from your mastery, they come from you using your defensives or your movement tools, so you don't even have to actually, plan them ahead of time or set them up in any way. They just come with the territory of playing augmentation. So the skill ceiling of the spec is quite low, right? You would think for a spec all about buffing, all about setting up others, etc., you would have had some more nuance, right? Some more min-maxing to have. Instead, we're still in the situation where 95% of the min-maxing of an Augmentation Evoker happens before you even pull the boss in a raid, where you have to decide who to buff, who to give prescience to, how to time your buffs with their cooldowns, and that happens before you even start to actually play the game. That seems to be the bigger concern to me when it comes to playing this spec, because when it comes to actually performing in-game, it does seem like a pretty straightforward, simple, easy to execute kind of spec. That's perhaps the biggest annoyance when looking at the spec from a playability aspect. Definitely, at the very least, as we get closer to Season 4 and the release of the next expansion, where presumably we will see more and more, of course, changes to the spec, it has gotten to a more decent level. But definitely, it's still at a very high risk of skewing back to its previous level of power, depending on the buffs Blizzard is going to give them or the changes Blizzard is going to give the spec in the next expansion, right? Hoping that they got the message, hoping that they understood that a DPS spec overly buffing, especially the other roles, the tank and the healer, in ways that other DPS specs can never match, can become quite oppressive for the other specs to compete with, especially in Mythic Plus, where you only have 5 options, you only have 3 DPS slots, so it's very easy to become too powerful in that 5-man group compared to a raid. So my overall judgment is like a passable 6+, 6.5, maybe we round it up to 7 because of the innovation of adding a support spec to the game, but the overall rating gets dragged down by, number one, the time it took to actually implement a non-completely broken OP type of spec, which took months and made the game worse for many other specs pushed out of the meta because of this augmentation spec, and then more so also because of the spec's simplicity, ease to execute, and lack of min-maxing and satisfying ways to pull off your rotation that other specs might have, but augmentation doesn't really. So those would be my main pet peeves about augmentation as a final vote for this expansion, for the introduction of this support spec. Of course, I'm gonna leave your own judgments of this spec up to the rest of the community, how they feel about the spec, if they are sick already or if they don't really mind being around an Augmentation Evoker. That was the point of this video, gauging the community response to this newly added role, we can say, this support DPS spec added in Dragonflight. So, with this point out of the way, it's time now to leave each other on this Monday. We're starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free, by liking and commenting down below to help with the YouTube algorithm, together with subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, as I open my window, back to the sound of the falling rain, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, finally, back to what I wanted, the cold, the rain, but without the sun reflecting on my monitor screens. That's the best scenario.